Tonight, we're going to explore the story of Roman Britain. From the quiet tribal villages that existed before the Romans arrived, to the roads, towns, and walls built by one of history's most powerful empires. This is a calm journey through history, designed to help you relax and unwind. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's slowly travel back nearly 2,000 years to the time when the Roman Empire reached the shores of Britain. Long before Roman soldiers marched across the island, Britain was a quiet and distant land on the edge of the known world. There were no stone cities rising above the hills, no straight roads cutting through forests and fields, and no single ruler governing the land. Instead, Britain was home to many small, tribal societies, communities who lived closely with the land around them. Most of the people living here belonged to groups we now call the Celts. The Celts were not one united nation. Rather, they were many tribes spread across the island, each with its own leaders, customs, and territories. Some tribes lived in the rolling hills of southern England. Others settled near rivers and fertile valleys. Further north, communities adapted to rougher landscapes, where forests were thick and the land rose into rugged highlands. Despite these differences, many aspects of life were shared between the tribes. Most people lived in small farming settlements. Homes were usually roundhouses, simple but practical buildings constructed from wooden beams, woven branches, and thick layers of clay or mud. The roofs were made from tightly packed thatch, often built from straw or reeds gathered from nearby fields and wetlands. From a distance, a settlement might appear as a small cluster of round roofs rising from open farmland. Inside these homes, a fire burned in the center of the room. The fire provided warmth during colder months, and a place where food could be cooked. Smoke slowly drifted upward through the thatched roof. There were no chimneys. Instead, the smoke escaped gradually through small gaps in the roofing material. The inside of the house would have been dim and warm, with the smell of wood smoke lingering in the air. Furniture was simple. Wooden stools, low tables, and storage chests held the belongings of the household. Animal skins and woven wool blankets were used for warmth during the night. Life followed a steady rhythm shaped by the seasons. In spring, fields were prepared for planting. Farmers worked the soil using iron tools and wooden plows pulled by animals. Crops such as barley, wheat, and oats were commonly grown. During summer, fields turned golden as crops ripened under long daylight hours. Autumn was the time of harvest. Families gathered together to collect grain and store food that would last through the colder months. Winter was quieter. Work slowed as the days became shorter. People spent more time indoors, repairing tools, weaving cloth, and telling stories around the fire. Animals were an important part of daily life. Sheep were kept for wool, which could be spun and woven into clothing. Cattle provided milk and were valuable for farming work. Pigs were raised for meat, often allowed to roam through nearby forests in search of food. Clothing was made mostly from wool. Women spun wool into thread and wove it into fabric using simple looms. Garments were usually practical and warm, designed to protect against the often damp and windy climate of the island. Many people wore cloaks fastened with decorative brooches made from bronze or iron. Even in small villages, craftsmanship was valued. Skilled metalworkers shaped tools, knives, and weapons from iron. Jewelry was also crafted with care. Torques, thick metal necklaces worn around the neck, were a well-known symbol of Celtic culture. These items were often beautifully decorated with intricate patterns. Trade connected Britain to lands beyond the sea. Although the island might have seemed remote, merchants traveled between Britain and mainland Europe. One of Britain's most valuable resources was tin. Tin was an important ingredient used to create bronze, a metal widely used throughout the ancient world. Large quantities of tin were mined in the southwest of Britain, particularly in areas that are now part of Cornwall. This metal was transported across the sea and traded with other cultures. So even before the arrival of the Romans, Britain was already connected to distant parts of Europe. Across the countryside, tribes sometimes built defensive settlements known as hill forts. These forts were often constructed on high ground, where people could see far across the surrounding landscape. Large banks of earth were piled up to create protective walls. Wooden fences, called palisades, were built along the tops of these earthworks. Inside the walls, homes and storage buildings were arranged to form small communities. Hill forts served several purposes. They offered protection during times of conflict. They also acted as centers for trade, gatherings, and tribal leadership. One of the largest hill forts in Britain is Maiden Castle, located in what is now Dorset. The enormous earth walls still remain today, rising quietly above the fields. Walking through the site today, it is possible to imagine how the settlement once looked, filled with people, animals, and the daily activity of village life. Religion and spirituality were deeply connected to nature. Sacred places were often found in forests, near rivers, or on hilltops. Natural landscapes held powerful meaning. The religious leaders of Celtic society were known as Druids. Druids were respected figures who acted as priests, teachers, and advisors. They led ceremonies and preserved the traditions of their people. Unlike the Romans, who would later arrive, Celtic cultures relied heavily on spoken knowledge. Stories, laws, and teachings were passed down through memory rather than written texts. Because of this, much of Celtic life has remained mysterious to historians. Yet the traces they left behind, tools, jewelry, settlements, and monuments, give us glimpses into their world. For many generations, life across Britain continued in this quiet and steady way. Farmers worked their fields. Families gathered around fires at night. Villages grew slowly across hills and valleys. But beyond the shores of the island, a powerful empire was expanding. An empire that built roads stretching for thousands of miles. An empire that commanded vast armies and ruled over many lands. This empire was Rome, and soon the distant island of Britain would begin to draw the attention of Roman leaders. The quiet rhythms of tribal life were about to change. A new chapter in the history of Britain was approaching. For many years, Britain remained a distant island, known to the Romans, but not fully controlled by them. Roman traders had heard stories about the land across the sea. They knew of its tribes, its metals, and its position at the far edge of the known world. In fact, the Romans had already attempted to reach Britain once before. In 55 BC, the famous Roman general Julius Caesar crossed the English Channel with a small fleet. Caesar's expedition was not a full invasion. It was more of a reconnaissance mission, an attempt to explore the island and learn about its people. The Roman soldiers landed somewhere along the southern coast of Britain. They encountered local tribes who were ready to defend their land. Although Caesar managed to step onto British soil, the campaign did not lead to long-term control. After brief fighting and negotiations, the Romans returned to the continent. Nearly a century would pass before Rome attempted another serious invasion. By the year 43 AD, the Roman Empire had grown even more powerful. Its influence stretched across much of Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. At this time, the Emperor of Rome was Claudius. Claudius sought to strengthen his reputation as a leader and expand Roman territory. Britain presented an opportunity. The island held valuable resources, and conquering it would bring prestige to the emperor. So Claudius ordered a full-scale invasion. This time, Rome did not send a small expedition. Instead, a powerful army of around 40,000 soldiers was assembled. The invasion force included highly trained Roman legionaries, along with auxiliary troops recruited from other parts of the empire. The Roman army was one of the most disciplined and organized forces in the ancient world. Soldiers trained constantly. They marched in tight formations and followed strict commands. Their equipment was designed for both protection and efficiency. Each legionary carried a large, rectangular shield known as a scutum. They wore metal armor and helmets that protected their bodies during battle. Their main weapon was the gladius, a short sword designed for close combat. Roman soldiers also carried throwing spears called pilum, which could be launched at enemy lines before advancing. In the spring of 43 AD, the invasion fleet crossed the Channel. The army landed on the southern coast of Britain, likely near modern-day Kent. For the tribes living there, the sight must have been astonishing. Hundreds of ships arriving from the sea, thousands of soldiers stepping onto the shore in organized ranks. The Roman advance soon met resistance. Several Celtic tribes attempted to stop the Roman army as it moved inland. But the Roman legions were experienced fighters. They advanced steadily, using disciplined formations and superior equipment. One important battle took place along the river Medway. Roman forces fought local tribal armies for 2 days before eventually gaining the advantage. After securing key positions in the south, the Roman army pushed further into the island. Emperor Claudius himself briefly traveled to Britain to celebrate the progress of the campaign. According to Roman records, Claudius arrived with additional reinforcements and even war elephants. Although the elephants were likely used more for dramatic effect than actual battle, their presence symbolized the power of Rome. After several victories, the Romans captured an important tribal stronghold known as Camulodunum. Today, this place is known as Colchester. Camulodunum soon became the first major Roman administrative center in Britain. From there, Roman control slowly expanded across much of southern England. However, conquering Britain was not a quick process. Some tribes accepted Roman rule through alliances and agreements. Others resisted fiercely. One of the most famous acts of resistance would occur later during the rebellion of Boudica, a Celtic queen who led a powerful uprising against Roman control. But during the early years of the invasion, the Roman army focused on establishing its presence. Forts were built to secure newly captured areas. Roads were constructed to connect settlements and allow troops to move quickly across the landscape. The Romans were not only soldiers, they were also skilled engineers. Wherever they went, they built infrastructure that strengthened their control. Over time, Roman influence began to reshape the island. New towns appeared. Trade expanded. Roman culture slowly blended with local traditions. For the tribes who had lived on the island for generations, life was beginning to change. The quiet world of hill forts and tribal territories was gradually being replaced by something very different. Britain was becoming a province of the Roman Empire, and over the next several centuries, Roman rule would leave a lasting mark on the island, shaping its towns, its roads, and its history in ways that can still be seen today. As Roman control spread across Britain, the landscape of the island slowly began to change. The Romans were not only soldiers, they were also builders, planners, and engineers. Wherever Roman armies established control, they often began constructing towns, roads, and public buildings. These new settlements introduced ways of life that were very different from the tribal villages that had existed before. One of the most important Roman settlements in Britain was Londinium. This settlement would later grow into the modern city of London. Londinium began as a small trading town built near a crossing point on the River Thames. The location was ideal. Ships could travel along the river carrying goods from across the Roman Empire. Merchants arrived bringing pottery, wine, olive oil, and other goods from distant provinces. Local traders exchanged metals, grain, and wool produced in Britain. Over time, Londinium became one of the busiest trading centers in Roman Britain. The town grew steadily. Streets were laid out in organized patterns. Buildings were constructed using stone and brick rather than wood. Markets appeared where people could buy food, clothing, tools, and imported goods. Public buildings were also an important part of Roman towns. Bathhouses were among the most popular. Roman baths were not only places for washing, they were also social centers where people gathered to relax and talk. Visitors would move through a series of rooms with different temperatures. There were warm baths, hot steam rooms, and cold pools. These bathhouses were heated using a clever system known as a hypocaust. Hot air from furnaces was directed beneath the floors, warming the rooms above. This method allowed large buildings to be heated even during colder months. Another important building found in Roman towns was the Forum. The Forum acted as the center of public life. It was a large, open square surrounded by government buildings, temples, and marketplaces. Here, officials made announcements, traders sold goods, and citizens gathered to discuss local matters. Roman culture valued organization and structure. This could be seen clearly in the design of their towns. Streets were usually laid out in straight lines, forming a grid pattern. This made navigation easier and allowed towns to grow in an orderly way. But perhaps the most famous Roman engineering achievement in Britain was their road network. Roman roads were built to allow soldiers, officials, and traders to travel quickly across the province. These roads were carefully designed. The ground was first dug out and filled with layers of stones and gravel. On top of this foundation, flat stones were placed to create a strong surface. Roman roads were often very straight. Rather than winding around hills and forests, they frequently cut directly across the landscape. Even today, many modern roads in Britain follow the routes first established by the Romans. One well-known example is Watling Street. This major Roman road connected Londinium to other important towns and forts across the island. Another important route, Ermine Street, stretched north toward what is now Lincoln and York. These roads allowed the Roman army to move quickly if trouble arose. They also made trade easier. Merchants could transport goods more efficiently between towns and ports. Along many roads, travelers could find small settlements known as roadside stations. These places offered food, shelter, and fresh horses for travelers making long journeys. Life in Roman towns was often busier than life in traditional Celtic villages. Markets were lively. Craftsmen worked in workshops producing pottery, tools, jewelry, and textiles. Bakers produced bread in stone ovens. Blacksmiths shaped iron tools and weapons. Children played in the streets while merchants called out to customers passing by. However, not everyone lived inside these towns. Much of the population still lived in the countryside. Farmers worked the land in rural estates known as villas. Roman villas could be quite large and comfortable homes. They often had multiple rooms, decorated floors, and sometimes even small bathhouses. Mosaic floors made from tiny, colored stones sometimes decorated the interiors of these homes. These mosaics displayed patterns, animals, and scenes from Roman myths. The villas were usually surrounded by farmland. Here, crops were grown and animals were raised to support the local economy. Through towns, roads, and farms, Roman influence slowly spread across Britain. The island was no longer simply a land of scattered tribes. Instead, it had become part of a vast empire that stretched across continents. The systems built by the Romans allowed people, goods, and ideas to move more freely than ever before. And although the Roman Empire would eventually leave Britain centuries later, many of their roads, towns, and traditions would remain, quietly shaping the landscape long after the legions had gone. As Roman control spread across much of Britain, the empire faced a challenge in the far north of the island. The land beyond northern England was home to tribes who did not easily accept Roman rule. These tribes lived in what is now Scotland. To the Romans, this region was wild and difficult to control. The landscape was rugged. Rolling hills, dense forests, and open moorland made travel difficult. The tribes who lived there knew the land well and resisted Roman attempts to push further north. Roman armies did try to expand into this territory. For a time, they built forts and attempted to control parts of the region. But holding the northern lands proved difficult. The effort required constant military presence, long supply lines, and difficult campaigns in unfamiliar terrain. Eventually, Roman leaders decided on a different approach. Instead of continuing to push north, they would create a clear boundary marking the edge of Roman Britain. In the year 122 AD, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, construction began on one of the most famous structures in British history. This structure became known as Hadrian's Wall. The wall stretched across northern England, from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. In total, it extended roughly 73 miles, crossing hills, valleys, and open countryside. The wall was not just a simple barrier. It was part of a large defensive system designed to control movement across the frontier. In many places, the wall was built from stone. Elsewhere, especially in earlier sections, it was made from turf and earth. The wall stood around 15 feet high in some areas and was wide enough for soldiers to walk along the top. At regular intervals, small forts known as mile castles were built. These replaced roughly every Roman mile along the wall. Each mile castle housed a small group of soldiers responsible for guarding gates and watching the surrounding land. Between the mile castles were watchtowers, allowing soldiers to observe the frontier and signal to nearby forts if needed. Larger forts were also constructed along the wall. These forts housed hundreds of soldiers. They included barracks, workshops, storage buildings, and headquarters. Some even had bathhouses, reminding soldiers of Roman comforts even on the distant frontier. Life for the soldiers stationed at Hadrian's Wall could be quiet but demanding. Many of the troops were not originally from Britain. Auxiliary units were recruited from across the Roman Empire. Some soldiers came from what is now Spain. Others came from regions that are now part of Germany, France, or the Middle East. These men served far from their homes, guarding a frontier on the edge of the Roman world. Daily life followed a strict routine. Soldiers patrolled the wall, maintained equipment, and trained regularly. They also helped maintain the wall itself, repairing damaged sections and strengthening defensive structures. Despite its defensive purpose, Hadrian's Wall was not meant to completely stop movement. Instead, it controlled it. Certain gates allowed travelers, merchants, and local people to cross the frontier under Roman supervision. Goods moving between the north and south could be inspected. Taxes could be collected. The wall acted as both a military defense and a controlled border. Over time, small communities developed near the forts. Merchants, craftsmen, and families settled close to the soldiers. These settlements, known as vici, grew slowly along the frontier. Traders sold food, clothing, tools, and other supplies to the military garrisons. In this way, even the remote northern frontier became connected to the wider Roman world. Today, the remains of Hadrian's Wall can still be seen stretching across the countryside. In some places, long sections of stone wall remain standing. In others, only grassy earthworks mark where the structure once stood. Walking along the wall today offers a quiet glimpse into life nearly 2,000 years ago. It reminds us of the effort the Romans invested in protecting their empire. And it shows just how far their influence reached, extending even to the wind-swept hills of northern Britain. For centuries, soldiers watched the horizon from the top of this wall. Beyond it lay lands that Rome chose not to fully conquer. But within it, Roman Britain continued to grow, with towns, roads, and communities slowly shaping the island. And for many years, Hadrian's Wall stood as the northern edge of that world. Although Roman soldiers and officials played an important role in governing the province, most people living in Roman Britain were not soldiers at all. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and families who lived ordinary lives across the countryside and within growing towns. For many people, daily life continued to revolve around farming. Large areas of Britain remained rural, and food production was essential for both local communities and the Roman military. Farmers grew crops such as wheat, barley, and oats. Vegetables, including cabbage, onions, and beans, were also commonly grown. Fields were plowed using wooden tools strengthened with iron blades. Oxen were often used to pull plows through the soil. These animals were strong and steady, making them well suited to the slow work of farming. Alongside crops, farmers kept animals. Cattle were valuable for milk and labor. Sheep were raised for their wool, which could be spun into thread and woven into cloth. Pigs were also common, often allowed to roam woodland areas where they could feed on acorns and roots. Much of this farming took place on rural estates known as villas. Roman villas were large country homes surrounded by farmland. Some villas were simple and practical. Others belonged to wealthy families and were built with impressive features. Stone walls replaced wooden structures. Roofs were covered with tiles instead of thatch. Inside, rooms were sometimes decorated with colorful wall paintings and mosaic floors. These mosaics were carefully arranged patterns made from thousands of tiny pieces of colored stone. Some mosaics showed animals, geometric patterns, or scenes from Roman mythology. Many villas also included bathhouses and heating systems. The same hypocaust system used in Roman towns could also be found in wealthier homes. This allowed warm air from a furnace to circulate beneath the floors, heating the rooms above. For the people living there, this would have been a remarkable comfort during cold winters. Beyond farming, many people worked in skilled trades. Blacksmiths forged iron tools, weapons, and household objects. Potters produced ceramic bowls, jars, and cooking vessels. Carpenters built furniture, wagons, and wooden structures. Cloth production was another important activity. Wool from sheep was cleaned, spun into thread, and woven into fabric. This cloth could then be used to make clothing, cloaks, and blankets. Markets were common in Roman towns. Here, traders displayed goods brought from many parts of the empire: wine from southern Europe, olive oil from Mediterranean regions, glassware, jewelry, and fine pottery from distant provinces. Local farmers also brought produce to these markets, selling grain, vegetables, and meat. Markets were lively places filled with voices, movement, and the smells of cooking food. Food itself was an important part of daily life. Bread was a staple of the Roman diet. Grain was ground into flour and baked into loaves. Vegetables, herbs, and meat were added to stews and soups. Fish was also common, especially in areas near rivers or the coast. Roman cooking often included sauces and herbs that were new to Britain at the time. One famous Roman sauce was called garum, a fermented fish sauce widely used throughout the empire. Although it might seem unusual today, it was very popular in Roman kitchens. Children growing up in Roman Britain would have experienced a mixture of cultures. Some families followed Roman traditions closely. Others continued older Celtic customs. Over time, these traditions blended together. Latin, the language of Rome, was used in administration and official documents. But many local people continued speaking their native Celtic languages. Religion was also diverse. Roman gods such as Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva were worshipped in temples built across the province. At the same time, older Celtic spiritual beliefs continued. Sometimes these traditions even merged. Local gods were occasionally identified with Roman ones, creating unique forms of worship. Temples and shrines appeared in towns, villages, and rural landscapes. People visited these places to make offerings and ask for protection, health, or good fortune. Life in Roman Britain was not always peaceful. Occasional uprisings and conflicts occurred, especially during the early years of Roman rule. But for long stretches of time, daily life settled into a steady rhythm. Farmers worked their fields. Craftsmen practiced their trades. Children played in streets and courtyards. Merchants traveled along Roman roads, carrying goods from town to town. Across the island, Roman influence slowly became part of everyday life. The province of Britain was no longer just a distant land of tribes. It had become an active part of the Roman world, and for nearly 4 centuries, this way of life would continue. But eventually, far away in the heart of the empire, events were unfolding that would change Britain once again. The Roman Empire was beginning to face new pressures, and in time, Roman soldiers would slowly withdraw from the island they had once conquered. For nearly 400 years, Roman rule shaped life in Britain. Towns had grown across the province. Roads connected distant settlements. Roman culture had blended with local traditions. For many generations, this system brought stability and order to much of the island. But far away from Britain, deep within the Roman Empire itself, problems were beginning to grow. The empire had expanded across vast territories, from Britain in the northwest to the deserts of the Middle East and the shores of North Africa. Holding such a large empire together required enormous resources. Armies had to be stationed across many provinces. Roads and fortifications needed constant maintenance. And as time passed, new threats began appearing along the empire's borders. Tribes from northern and eastern Europe started moving toward Roman territory. Some came searching for new lands to settle. Others came as raiders. These pressures forced Roman leaders to shift their attention toward defending the core regions of the empire. Britain, far away across the sea, slowly became less important in Roman strategy. At the same time, internal struggles within the empire created instability. Different generals competed for power. Civil wars occasionally broke out between rival leaders. These conflicts weakened the empire's ability to control distant provinces. Roman Britain began to feel the effects. Maintaining the army in Britain required money, supplies, and reinforcements. But as the empire faced greater threats elsewhere, resources became limited. Gradually, Roman troops were withdrawn from the island. Some soldiers were sent to defend other parts of the empire. Others were recalled to support Roman leaders during political struggles. By the early 5th century, Britain was becoming increasingly isolated. Roman officials struggled to maintain authority. Local communities had to take on more responsibility for their own protection. In 410 AD, the Roman Emperor Honorius reportedly sent a message to the cities of Britain. According to historical accounts, The emperor informed them that they would now need to organize their own defense. Roman support would no longer be available. This moment is often seen as the symbolic end of Roman rule in Britain. The legions that had once marched across the island were now gone. The great empire that had built towns, roads, and fortifications had turned its attention elsewhere. Without Roman administration, many towns slowly declined. Public buildings fell into disrepair. Some stone structures were dismantled as people reused materials for smaller buildings. Trade networks that had connected Britain to the wider empire also began to weaken. Goods from distant Roman provinces became harder to obtain. Local economies gradually became more self-reliant. Yet Roman influence did not disappear overnight. The roads remained. The towns still stood, even if some were quieter than before. Roman farming techniques and building methods continued to be used, and many people living in Britain had grown up within Roman society. The legacy of Rome was deeply woven into the landscape. Even centuries later, travelers could still follow the straight paths of Roman roads. Fragments of walls, forts, and villas remained scattered across fields and hills. These silent ruins told the story of a time when Britain had been part of one of the most powerful empires in history. But as Roman authority faded, a new chapter was beginning. Without the protection of Roman armies, Britain became vulnerable once again. New groups of people would soon arrive from across the sea. They would bring different customs, languages, and ways of life. These newcomers would shape the next period of British history. The age of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was about to begin, and the island would once again begin to change. Although Roman rule in Britain eventually came to an end, its influence did not simply disappear. In many ways, the Romans left a lasting mark on the island, one that can still be seen today. Across Britain, the remains of Roman roads still lie beneath modern highways. Many of the straight routes drivers follow today were first built nearly 2,000 years ago by Roman engineers. Their careful construction allowed people, goods, and armies to move quickly across the province. Even after the Roman administration had left, these roads continued to guide travel across the countryside. Roman towns also left their mark. Places like Londinium, Eboracum, which is now York, and Verulamium, near modern-day St. Albans, became important centers during the Roman period. Some of these towns continued to exist long after Roman rule ended. Others slowly faded as populations moved away or settlements shifted. Yet beneath modern streets and buildings, Roman foundations still remain. Archaeologists continue to uncover fragments of Roman life hidden beneath layers of earth and stone. Pieces of pottery, coins stamped with the faces of Roman emperors, fragments of mosaic floors. These discoveries give us glimpses into daily life nearly 2,000 years ago. Roman Britain also left behind cultural influences. Certain farming techniques introduced by the Romans continued to be used. New foods, building styles, and tools became part of life on the island. Even the idea of organized towns and roads helped shape how communities developed in the centuries that followed. But perhaps the most important legacy of Roman Britain is the story it represents. For almost 4 centuries, the island had been part of a vast empire that stretched across continents. Roman soldiers had marched along its roads. Merchants had traded goods from distant lands. Families had built homes and communities under Roman rule. When the empire withdrew, Britain did not simply return to the world it had once been. Instead, it entered a new and uncertain period. Without Roman protection, the island became vulnerable to new arrivals and new challenges. Communities had to organize their own defense. Old towns changed. New leaders emerged. Over time, different groups from Northern Europe would settle in Britain. They would establish kingdoms that slowly reshaped the island once again. These new arrivals would become known as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Their story would form the next chapter in the history of Britain. But the traces of Roman Britain would remain, quietly woven into the landscape. Stone walls weathered by centuries, straight roads stretching across green fields, and hidden beneath the ground, the silent remains of towns that once stood at the edge of the Roman world. Roman Britain may have ended, but its legacy continued to shape the island for generations to come. And that brings us to the end of this chapter of Britain's story. From the arrival of Roman legions to the towns, roads, and communities they built across the island, Roman Britain left a lasting mark on the landscape. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore what happened after the Romans left, when new kingdoms began to rise across the island. If you enjoy calm history like this, you can subscribe for more long, relaxing journeys through the past. For now, thank you for listening, and have a peaceful night.